so many different sides of the game of design and design curation.
Yeah.
How long were you at the Design Museum?
8 years.
8 years. And was that entirely under Alice Rawsthorne's directorship? That's
Yes.
right, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. So you weren't part of the move to Olympia.
No, and certainly the conversation about moving was happening whilst I was there, but it hadn't got as far as where it was when Dan took over.
Just before we get on to more recent projects and looking at images, can you just give a very brief sense of what the years of the Design Museum were like there when you were in Shad Thames, and sort of what you brought forward from that experience into your independent curating?
Sure. Well, as I say, I was given quite a lot of freedom, and I took over quite a lot of incidental spaces that nobody else was using, or that were not considered a traditional white cube environment. So the stairwell, the cafe, the loos, or any corner I could, and ran all sorts of different programs, predominantly for emerging designers, because at that time there wasn't a lot of opportunity for young designers to be able to work in institutions and to be able to benefit from the machinations of an institution. And because we collection or a public collection, we didn't have to sort of abide by some of the draconian and very slow rules of exhibition production. We could turn things around really quickly, and that's what I did. And it introduced me to, as I said, a whole slew of designers that I subsequently went on to represent in the gallery. But I think it was just appreciating the narrative power of design. And I love telling stories. That is what appeals to me most about the job that I do, is the opportunity to engage with something and look for a story through it. And I was able to tell so many of them in those days. Obviously, the museum had some politics. It wasn't a government-funded collection, so financing was always tricky.
Yeah.
Which did inform quite a lot of the decisions that we had to make. But it didn't limit the creativity. It just forced us to find, ever more inventive solutions.
That's interesting, isn't it? In the design field, when you're thinking about sponsorship and collaboration, even with external partners who might be corporate partners, there's always this kind of potential gray zone that one can wander into when you're sort of exhibiting the same people that are making it possible for you to exhibit them. That's certainly something I experienced at the Museum of Arts and Design, and I wonder whether it's something you also thought about in your time.
Actually, we had quite strict policies that there wasn't, that sponsors were not allowed to include their work. In fact, even to the point that an exhibition that I was not involved with, but there was a big touring exhibition of aluminum. I think Carnegie had initiated, and it came to the Design Museum, and BMW were one of the principal sponsors, and the director had decided that they were not going to be showing their brand new aluminum car in the Design Museum. So they built a car display space outside the museum, on the waterfront side of the museum. As soon as the car left, I took over and used the public programming project.
It was one of the most visible parts of the museum, actually, because that was such a trafficked area along the Thames there. And it was sort of nodded just the right amount to Damien Hirst as well, that sort of white box. Well, let's, speaking of Damien Hirst, let's talk about Frieze, but not the Damien Hirst show Frieze, but instead this project that you have coming up imminently.
Yes.
At Frieze, the art fair. So can you just tell folks a little bit about this?
Sure. So Frieze Viewing Room, what had started as a curated selling exhibition for Frieze New York, due to the obvious issues caused by the global pandemic, everybody's had to shift and change fast. And the invitation for me to be involved with this, so now it's going to be in Randall's Island. And it's going to launch, I think the 8th of May is the first, there we go, yes, the first public day. But the invitation to be involved with this actually came through Collective Design Fair. And it's been part of Frieze New York's mission to collaborate with all sorts of different disciplines outside of the art world. And I guess it made sense when they were thinking to do a design project that they collaborate with somebody like Stephen Lerner in Collective Design. So the invitation came to me to help work with Stephen to help form and define some of his very early ideas, which were based around the idea of color in art and design, which is a huge topic and has really different connotations for both industries. And I was very aware, I guess, in design, and particularly in industrial design, that color is often the last decision to happen. It's the last of a very long line of decisions. And I was wary of making this or opening any potential dialogue about the design selection being styling or decoration. So stripped it right back and went back to, I guess, a material studies approach for the exhibition, to choose works in which the color is inherent to the material. And I guess even the history of art and design, and certainly the history of modern art and design, and its use of color, it very much follows that of the scientific developments in materials. So from the development of synthetic, organic, aniline pigments put into paint tubes, through to plastic, through to digital, electronic, or now even nanotechnologies. So this is the trajectory that I've been following, looking for art and design that would fit this thesis, but working with commercial galleries in Europe, North America, and South America, and their inventories to select works that could be made available to our exhibition.
So it's very much looking at color both as a material practice and a conceptual practice, as well as obviously an aesthetic one.
Yeah, more along, we'd sort of delve into color theory, certainly through the works of Joseph Albers, Helle Jongerius, David Batchelor, but I'm trying not to make it a subjective conversation. It's very much an objective one, because I think that's where the divergency would happen between art and design. And I didn't want to create any schism. So I had to try and find the most objective rationale possible. So it is very much materials based. And I think where design practice and history is based on the study of materials, whereas in art criticism and theory, perhaps maybe not so much. It's been sidelined. Yet I think as more academics turn to the stuff of this world, materiality is gaining traction again. And it's something that you've certainly written a lot about, Glenn. So.
One sometimes uses the phrase material turn to describe that. And material turn, so historians or even philosophers thinking more about materiality. I often use the term material intelligence as a way of describing that kind of pervasive concern. So that's a great project. So it'll be online on May 8th, so people can.
Yeah. So I'm slightly under embargo as to how much we can give away right now, so apologies for that.
Okay, well, let's just do a couple of images though.
Yeah. So this beautiful Bruno Munari piece, which was actually designed as a water fountain for Eco Parisi, but it is a study of materials and of materials in motion. And I use this very clearly in the early part of the exhibition to talk about colour, metamerism and colour in movement, and how it's inconstant, and positioned it beside a Joseph Albers piece, which gives that same sort of interplay of movement of colour. Yeah.
Because there's always that fantastically interesting thing with color where there's the color as an external thing, like an object out in the world, and then how you perceive it. And Albers was so brilliant at showing you how different those two things could be. And this work looks like it would very much produce the same kind of thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. But, wholly dependent on, well, this must feel at home for all Friedman Bender.
Yeah, exactly.
This beautiful Kuramata piece we're borrowing from Friedman Bender, or consigning from Friedman Bender. A lot of these pieces I haven't actually seen. That is one of the great, sad points about this moving online, is that I was very much looking forward to the physical engagement with all these works and understanding their materiality and scale. So this piece I've only ever seen in images, but it does look very beautiful here.
And you get a great sense of, we had one of these in Postmodernism, the show I did at the V&A some years ago, and you get a great sense there in that right-hand shot of what it does in person. It just kind of totally dematerializes, and there's no two views of it that make it look like it's made of the same colors. It's an absolutely magical thing.
I hope we can do it justice.
Yeah, the brilliant Kuramada. Okay, so folks should definitely go and check that out, the Frieze viewing room. But this brings us to what I suppose is the main subject for discussion, Libby, which is an accelerated culture, the show that you and Brent Zachorias curated for Friedman Benda last year. And we'll just look at a few installation shots of this as we talk about it. But I'd love to hear a little bit about the show and what your intention was, but also would love to know what you think about the scene that you were documenting and the moment that you were speaking to in this exhibition, which was a moment of creativity.
You froze for a minute. You want to know, talk about the exhibition, but then also...
Well, just the scene that you were documenting, both in London and internationally, in that moment of creative explosion that you were exploring.
For sure. Again, invitation came through Mark Bender. Brent Zachorias was already involved and brought me in to help contextualize some of the ideas that they were having. And I guess the idea was, based around if design gives shape to the hopes and anxieties of every culture, what does the work coming out of the so-called Generation X say? And when I started to dig deeper, as a moniker, Generation X, which is the title of a book by Douglas Coupland, I almost went blank there, Douglas Coupland from 1991, which looked at, I guess, slacker cultures, apathetic, ennui, McJobs. It gave a very disheartening view of people born between the years mid-1960s and early 1980s. But when we compared this against the design culture at that time, we found it to be a very different scene. And indeed, the designers, they were all very entrepreneurial and energetic and go-getting and questioning of the industry in which they were finding themselves in and challenging stereotypes. So we sort of played off against this sort of inaccuracy between the book and the people that we wanted to focus on. Obviously any attempt to define a generation is rife with disclaimers. And I think the one thing that we really did find with this group, which is a beautiful image to have up because it shows all the designers in the show, was actually there was no unifying thing. The X actually stands for the unknown. It was very difficult to put a cloud around them and to group them all into one thing. Yet here in this beautiful infographic by Studio Frith, and a specially commissioned typeface that she'd done for the exhibition. We're trying to capture them amidst all the cultural, creative, political, and social events. Well, not all, because that would be impossible, but as many as we could fit on that wall that we felt may have been informing their practice. And, I think priding themselves on their independence, open to new ideas that don't conform, self-initiated and autonomous work that didn't rely on an overstuffed industry, were all these sort of characters that were the characteristics that all of these people, I think there's 18, were all engaging with.
I love this opening gesture curatorially, this mind map where you have the
premise of it.
Sorry. You froze again. Carry on.
But they are also, because of the context in which we're showing this, in a commercial design gallery, of course they are all collectible pieces, but we were specifically looking for works that I think were visible and highly charged and defined a sense of these characteristics that we were talking about: energy, enthusiasm, entrepreneurialism, dynamism of materials, forcing of boundaries, pushing of boundaries. So, yeah.
I was going to say, Libby, I love this as a curatorial opening gesture, this mind map where you have the designers jostling in the midst of all these other cultural phenomena. And it definitely also gives you that tug of nostalgia, and also you kind of shake your head and realize that technology was so emergent at that time, with things like as 95, right? Or the very first emergence of tagging as a concept, those kinds of, and it's graffiti tagging, but also digital tagging. And I guess one question that I had for you was how you account for the energy that came into the design field at this time. What do you think the factors were that actually prompted that entrepreneurialism?
Okay, well, I think We were really looking at people freshly out of college, so who were establishing their practice in the early 90s or from the early 90s. So if you're born between 1965 and 85, there's a roll-on effect to when you're establishing your practice.
Which
But
you and I both, we were both born smack in the middle of that range, of course, Libby, because both of us are 92.
I feel comfortable in this room.
Yeah.
But I think a large part of it is determined by education. And at that time, heads of major, and we did focus predominantly on European. I can't make, I'm not going to apologize for that. I am based in the UK, working with quite a lot of European designers. But I think that's where the safe space was for designers to be more experimental, but be more explorative, or be more conceptual, critical of the work, because there were so many grants and funds that enabled them to either both carry on for their studies or indeed free education in places like the Royal College of Art or Eindhoven or Cal or in France at the Sorbonne, or all through. And also the teachers themselves, with Ron Harrod, last week's guest, head of product design at the Royal College, Jürgen Bay, Helle Jongerius, Lee Edelcourt, etc. These people had already gone through this argument. They'd already gone through the breaking open of boundaries of what their students were the inheritors of all of this freedom. And there was already, at the same time, an emerging market wanting more, or a sophisticated market who wanted more from the items that they chose to surround themselves with than what was readily available on the high street. So it was a confluence of wonderful, positive events that helped enable these people feel enthusiastic and gave me the confidence to go forward with their practice.
Yeah. Do you think that there was also a shift in the marketplace side, because you're emphasizing the educational infrastructure, which is no doubt crucial, but do you think that also because of emergent digital technology or some other factors, that there was also an easier route for designers to find financial support for these often quite avant-garde one-off gestures?
Yeah, well, I think there's two answers there. One thing I obviously forgot to say is that in this period also they're bridging the gap between the analog and the digital. So communication technologies that we take for granted today, hello Zoom, oh, the sun's coming in, sorry. It's a rare event, but it does happen in the UK. Communication technologies that we take for granted were, nascent then, but didn't take long for them to be taken hold of. So information, open source access to was very much agent. But also at the same time, you had the rise of collectible design galleries and also events such as, I think it was Design 05, which later became Design Miami, events, trade fairs. And again, as I say, the growing sophisticated awareness of the collector or the audience. So many new magazines were being launched at the time. Digital production costs had gone, or magazine production costs had gone down, so there was a plethora of content needed being found, and these people were all producing fantastic matter for that.
Yeah, there was a kind of sweet spot in terms of communications too, in a way, because you had emergent online communications at the same time that you had magazines, maybe in some ways still in their maximal exposure period left over from the 80s, when magazines had really driven the design discourse. So there's a really interesting kind of overlap there. What would you say about the London scene in particular, Libby, of which you were such an important part in those years, I guess towards the end of the period that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, you're very kind to say so. Listening to Ron's interview the other day, I think he's absolutely right to take credit for a large number of designers in London who were graduating out of the Royal College of Art, or indeed even Central St Martin's, and we're talking about London here, obviously, because London is not the UK. There are so many other sites and places for design to happen. I just think London's always been a magnet for it, and if it is not educational, it was because perhaps then there were cheap enough studios in East London for them to live in, and it's a sense of collaboration and community that I think has been generated, that they were able to rely and call on each other, which because the speed of which and the opportunities for communication are so fractured and so fast that we can't keep up. Whereas then, because of this strange straddling between analog and digital and reliant on knowing how to make things, but then how to also communicate it or digitally fabricate it, they had the best of both worlds. And it produced a slightly more well-rounded designer.
I guess that was one part of the reason why you chose the title An Accelerated Culture, because
Yeah.
it's not just about speed, it's also about the experience of more speed, the experience of acceleration, like being pressed back into your chair because the vehicle is, the gas pedal is on the floor,
Very nicely put. It's also the subtitle to Generation X. So.
Yeah. Douglas Copeland. But you really feel that in the objects because there was a kind of live wire quality to them, the connectedness of them, as much as there was a great diversity in the show. I hope people can see from the images, there's also a sense of invention, Joris Larman, Nendo, who we'll be speaking to next week, by the way. But there's a kind of commonality of energy, perhaps, if not a commonality of form or style.
Well, it's interesting, and certainly from that last image, the lights that were hanging in the far right-hand corner, that's Martin Bars and Bertrand Pot as a collaboration, and these collaborations played out time and time again. Nobody was precious or proprietorial, I guess. They wanted to share and communicate, which is a very generous approach.
Yeah. One last question about London. Would you say that this is thinking about like pre-Brexit London and the sort of intense internationalism of the city at that time? Did you feel like it was uniquely positioned in a sense between America and Europe as a center for design education, to some extent design galleries, but certainly design museums, including the one you were at? I feel like it had a kind of unique role at that time in the international design scene. Maybe it's hard for you to say because you were right in the center of it, but is that something that you perceived as well?
Well, definitely. I mean, if you look at all the nationalities of the people, even in this exhibition, very few of them were actually British. And yet these were the people that I was working with and talking to and showing. I'm not sure I was aware so much of an American presence. If you saw that was in your time in the UK, it'd be nice to hear, but it was predominantly European, increasingly more Asian, and now everything.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I would agree with that. I think the money was American in some cases, but the design talent very rarely so. And even now, it's amazing to see how much America lags behind. Sorry, I was just going to say it's amazing to see how much America lags behind Britain and Europe in the creation of leading edge talent, given the size of the country. Not that there's nobody, obviously there are some great talents here, but you'd expect it to be much more well represented in the international scene even today, but certainly at this time.
Well, not to say it doesn't exist, but yes, and I just wonder whether that's just, there are so many more now that everyone's competing against, that, as you said earlier, this generation were in a sweet spot and they got all the attention.
And did you, in fact, feel like you had a hand in this, looking back on it? Because it's funny, because curators often feel like they're just trying to see clearly what's happening, but there's a little bit of I'm not sure if I understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle enough to say this, but I think the thing is, if you try to locate the electron, you move it, right, through the act of trying to locate it. And there's something about that in the curatorial process, particularly when you are surrounded by a scene, that your very involvement starts to shift it. And I wonder whether you actually felt like you could sense the impact that your program at the Design Museum was having, or your subsequent activity.
Well, maybe not so much at the Design Museum, but certainly in running the commercial gallery, which I did for 7 years. Just because I've, since giving up the gallery, I've gone on to see what so many of the designers are now doing, and felt really proud of being part of the early stage development of their portfolios and careers. And I don't really like being modest, patting myself on the back, but there were some good people in that roster, and I'm really proud of them.
Yeah, Thank you for holding fast to your British your British character and not trying to blow your own horn there. Let's move on to a maybe more comfortable subject, which is this book, which
Ah.
is so important and really provides a look into not only the issue of gender in design, but also the specifics of these entrepreneurial practices. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about why you decided to write the book and also what kind of feedback you got on it.
Sure. Well, the why is very easy because it's certainly not the first book about female practitioners or indeed the gender imbalance within the design industry. But at the time we were heading up to, certainly in the UK, the centenary celebrations of the suffragettes' right to victory. So that was in 2018. So the book came out to coincide with that. It was one of a number of books about focusing on women. And I guess my role in writing it was, not to suggest that I was the first to discover, certainly just to remind people of some of the struggles, the misattributations, misaccreditations that have happened in the hope that we can stop this from happening because it continues. And the statistics of women practitioners at senior level is abysmally low, and there has to be some reason for that beyond child bearing responsibilities. And I do think that we still work in a very patriarchal industry, and so it's just about reminding people that it's a long battle, but we've got to keep on fighting it.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that we've been working very hard to get gender parity for the Design and Dialogue series itself. And it's turned out that the way that we've done that, at least so far, has been to invite curators and critics who are women, and in fact, predominantly women. There's much more representation in the curatorial core of women than men. And of course, we're inviting women designers too. We've had Najla Al-Zain, Faye Toogood. A week from today, we'll have Marlene Huissaud. We're hoping Neri Oxman here will join the series in due course. But it is astonishing, as you say, that that imbalance still exists in the field. I wonder what your thoughts are on why that is.
Okay, so Neri is a really good example here because I think where women have actually historically managed to succeed are in industries or sides of the design industry and where there are no gatekeepers. So Neri, in completely inventing tripartite relationship between biology, material science, architecture, and scientific research, has created a unique position. And the work coming out of the mediated matter group is exemplary. And I wish I would have been able to get to New York before MoMA shut down to see the exhibition. There are so many examples of this, and do you know what? My mind has just gone blank on the woman I wanted to talk about.
I just want to put in a word for craft as one of those areas because, of course, craft, weaving, ceramics, etc. That's often been a route for people into the design world because of precisely what you're saying, that there aren't those gatekeepers.
Yeah, so I think in instances where women can actually circumnavigate the system and create their own platform, they've been able to excel. Muriel Cooper, with her work at MIT in making the internet beautiful by inventing the relationship between text, font, type, again, an unfettered access to a brand new industry that was just emerging. And it's more than being at the right place at the right time, because you make those sorts of opportunities. She just had the proverbial to make it happen. So.
Yeah. One last question about this project, Libby. Did you feel also, generationally speaking, that you were part of a moment, that same moment that was documented in an accelerated culture, where the gender dynamic was at least shifting somewhat? I mean, there you were at the Design Museum with a woman as your director as well as Rossthorn. And you do have perhaps more incidents of design practice coming from women at that time and achieving a different level of profile. Is that something you picked up on at the time? Do you think that's right?
Certainly, the women that I interviewed of my generation to be in the book often would say that they didn't feel so put upon because of their gender. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. I don't know, I think it is definitely generational. It has changed, but I think the statistics bear out that it's not changed enough. I'm going to turn because I think you're going to actually lose me in this glare. So just 1 second.
You do have something of a halo there, Libby.
Yeah, well, that's there all the time.
That was my line.
Not quite the curated background, but a little less light.
Well, I suppose we could also talk about diversity in design in a broader sense too, in terms of ethnic, geographical diversity. So these are topics that we'll certainly get onto in the course of the Design and Dialogue series too. But time marching on as it is, I wanted to pick up on this super interesting theme that you suggested that we might close out our discussion. So this is really something that comes forward from the Accelerated Culture Show, and it has to do with the idea of autonomy, which for good reason we're introducing here with the work of Enzo Amari. So can you say a little bit about your thoughts about this concept of design as a kind of self-standing or self-reliant discipline?
Sure. Well, I think how this has come up in today's conversation is I have heard reference to autoprogettazione, apologies for my pronunciation, so much over recent weeks. And it's not just that Hans Ulrich Oberst has curated an exhibition for the Triennale in Milan, which hopefully we'll all get to see when the world reopens. I do think that the idea of using design to help, to help issues of sustainability, of healing, of collaboration are just rife right now. We don't have very much to work with, but what we do have are our connections and our people. If you can't access the studios, you can't access suppliers for materials, you can access conversations. And I think out of this, so that's why it's in my head right now. And when I look back at some of the designers that we've talked about today, and then certainly those that I'm really interested in watching when most of my days are now spent chained to a screen, I'm being drawn to this same idea again, and I think it does involve lessons that we can learn. I mean, obviously, Autoprogettazione was on the face of it, was a manual to make 19 different types of furniture. But Mari himself said it was never intended as a DIY manual, but it was a criticism of the design industry at the time of, the system of the manufacture, of the distribution and marketing and commerce of design. And not 10 minutes walk away from where I live now is an exhibition that picks up on those exact same themes, again, sadly shuttered, but by the Italian design duo, Forma Fantasma. And it was an exhibition called Cambio, which is questioning the timber industry and the inherent, I'm jumping on, and some of the inherent hypocrisies and the lack of regulation, which means that it doesn't live up to very good standards. And so Forma Fantasma have spent the last couple of years researching this. She produced this absolutely beautiful exhibition, but again is based on the notions of collaboration, of community, of open source, but then of sustainable and worthy and respectful working practices, which they hope by asking these kind of questions might influence how the industry responds. And right now, it's a prime moment, I guess, for everybody to ask important questions of themselves, and hopefully we'll come out the other side of this horrible and very sad moment with some positivity, that something good has come out of it. And so there's a nice sort of synergy, I guess, between this and the sort of Mari principle.
Yeah, you know, one thing that strikes me, this is maybe a weird observation, but the presence of the palettes in the Forma Phantasma show, which are so similar to the materiality of Enzo Mari's proposed furniture pieces. And I just was thinking about the way that when you're thinking about design as an autonomous practice, you also have to think about design as something in motion. Libby, you there? Ah, there you are. Yeah, we lost you for a second. So I was just going to say that the palette, the image of the palette, brings to mind the idea of design as something in motion. So when you think about design as an autonomous practice and this idea of auto projection, of course, you also have to think about design as something that's connective and related to broader trends. So you have to think about design as something that's relational to a larger economy and something that's always in movement. And it seems to me like this show does a fantastic job showing not only materiality as such, but also the way the materiality flows through the world.
Yeah, well, very much so, the distribution of it being a large part of it. And I think if given the opportunity, you know, all elements of the industry should be conceived from, well, certainly that's what the premise of Forma Phantasma's work is, you know, to be at the heart of it, making decisions of every single step of every single, you know, element of the industry, from research and design through to distribution, and holding people up to standards which currently aren't being met. So yeah.
Let's look at a couple of more images that you thought might be interesting to bring to the fore. Yeah.
Well, this is literal. This is just the literal, I guess, next generation of Enzo Mari's auto project Tazioni, where Todd Bunchi in 1998 did a series called Rough and Ready, where he too created a downloadable, courtesy of the advent of the internet, downloadable series of instructions to make furniture from found materials. Whereas, you know, and I guess capitalizing on the emergent communication technologies of the time. And Todd sort of felt on graduation from the Royal College of Art, he was very disheartened, I guess, by the lack of apathy that he saw in the industry at the time. So sort of about creating his own, creating his own narrative and bringing his own emotion and sensitivity into work. And so, you know, this was the direct heir to, I guess, Enzo Mari. Whereas I guess Forma Phantasma takes it to the next level, where it's not just criticizing the response of the industry, but the response of the entire, all elements of the industry, and not only making it theoretical, which the exhibition really is, but trying to embed this into the systems of companies. You know, their All Systems project, where they were looking at digital e-waste. You know, it would be a dream if they were able to use some of the suggestions and advice that they came up with at the end of that project, including the labeling of all the bits of metal that are in something as small as our iPhone, so that when they are completely broken down and redistributed and the minerals are harvested for other use, we know exactly what they are, because and you know, simple gestures, I guess, well, maybe not so simple, but still not impossible.
Let's look at a couple of other examples. This is another image from the Forma Phantasma show. And then you have this one by Gomper and Abake and Alex Rich.
Okay, so I mean, if you know, if my focus right now is on collaboration, this truly is the apex of it, I guess. Maybe 20 years ago, Gamper, Abake, and Rich started doing these events based around their shared love of food and cooking, but also to hope to create unusual and unique dialogues between people. And they created everything from the chairs to the tables to the plates to, I think, the cutlery and the food that was being eaten. I mean, this unfortunately could never happen right now. We look forward to the day where we can return to such events like this. But, you know, I think it just, for me, again, shows this spirit of generosity that design has the capacity to do, which I think is really needed right now. And you know, Gamper and her friends have been able to, you know, been doing this for decades, as I say. And it's that spirit that I'm so attracted to.
The real kind of generosity, you know, design as a kind of social practice, really.
Yeah. Fernando, lovely Fernando. So this is, Fernando is London trained, but Mexican based right now, designer, back in Mexico. He set up this project called Toto Moxtal, which looked at the aggressive agricultural use of maize in Mexico and how maize being used for so many more things other than corn. It's used for so many more things. And how with this very intensive agricultural push and industrialization of the maize industry has turned the farmlands to using unorganic corn seed and heavy fertilizers and chemicals that are actually killing the natural and indigenous corn and ruining the lives of such people. So Fernando has created a community of farmers to start using heirloom seeds gathered from a world seed bank to revitalize indigenous corn growth again. And the byproduct of this not only being a greater economy for the locals that are using this and better nutritional value of corn, but Fernando has turned the husks into like a wood veneer, which he's turning into commercial products, and all the funds go back to feed into the community project. So again, community collaboration, slightly more geopolitical, and looking at the future of food.
One thing that I think is really important here is that it highlights the fact that when we think about design and autonomy, we're not thinking necessarily about an individual designer in a studio just fending for themselves. We're also thinking about these microsystems like the one Fernando's creating.
But I guess it's sort of inventing your own narratives. It's invented, like Todd, when he came out of college being so disappointed by the industry that he thought he'd be walking into, that he invented his own in a way. And it's the same with this next generation, but they've taken it past sort of an internal conversation into a much more circular one that affects so many other communities other than the design industry. So the next generation.
Yeah, one last example, I think.
Yeah, okay. This one I'll do very quickly, because this one is really quite new to me, so I don't wish to do undue credit to it, but cooking sections, two London-based practitioners who, I'm afraid I want to look up their names, I'm sorry, gentlemen, Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alon Schwab, who again, looking at systems around the world involving food. You can see where my interests are at the moment.
Yeah. All of us feel the same, I think.
Where, again, intensive aquaculture in this instance has actually killed off native wildlife and ruined the water resources in this particular project in the Isle of Skye in Scotland through intensive salmon farming. So working with the local council, the local restaurateurs, the local farmers or fishermen, they've sort of sought to cease the salmon fishing and reintroduce bivalves and seaweed back into the dead waters to oxygenate and clean the waters and create entire, I guess, food systems around this healthy alternative source. And this structure that they've built during high tide is where the bivalves, mussels, mollusks, oysters, whatever, come to breathe, to feed, and also to regenerate the water. But in low tide, it turns into a table at which invited guests, locals, and residents can come and sit and learn and have workshops. So again, looking at using design to find solutions that save the planet. Something we need.
It's such a nice way of thinking about the design architecture interface too. Like it's designed for us table scale, but it's architecture for the bivalves. Before we leave the food topic entirely and turn to questions, we did just want to put in a word for this little initiative. Well, it could be a great big initiative by the end of it, but that you and MC Diderot have undertaken, Design Cucina.
Yeah, okay. So in Christmas last year, MC Maria Cristina Diderot, known affectionately as MC, and I did a project, a charity pop-up project, where we invited lots of designers to make Christmas decorations that we sold, and all the funds went to a homeless project here in London. So when the coronavirus 19 pandemic was kicking off, and we were thinking, well, what can we do? What resources can we use? And I, as you have learned, am obsessed by food. So I proposed this idea that we just simply invite designers to share something that they've cooked, and just to offer a bit of light-hearted relief and inspiration, as it says in our blurb, in these unprecedented housebound times. We reached out to half a dozen designers just to test the water, and the quality of results and the inspiration and humor and professionalism that we received back has been absolutely astounding. And we've only done 18 posts, and we got 435, and that was last week, I think. This is today's, prepared by none other than Glenn Adamson.
Yeah, this is where our interview turns into a kind of Mobius strip. Yeah, so this is just my kitchen counter, which is covered with tiles done by Mayberry and Walker, Philip Mayberry and Scott Walker, who built our house in the Hudson River Valley in the early 90s. And those are wild ramps, which I just had last night again, actually. So that's Design Cucina.
Design Cucina, yeah. So it does what it says on the label, and the response has been overwhelming. And it's just like the sun that's following me around as I run around the room. It is a bit of sunlight in my day each day.
Yeah. Well said. Great, Libby. Well, we actually have quite a few questions to get onto in our last 10 minutes. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take us out of the PowerPoint. Hello again. And we'll take our first question from Avsar Gurpanar, who's, I think, coming in from Istanbul, which is rather exciting. Avsar, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Hi, Libby. Yeah, this question came into my mind when I saw the names on the wall of the latest exhibition. And I try to follow like fairs and exhibitions as much as I can. And I kind of get this feeling of deja vu, like seeing similar names, like Konstantin Gurgic and Bakar and Mateli Krase and so on, and the Burlex as like so-called avant-garde artists / designers. Is it like they are keeping the front lines, so not letting the young and unknown avant-garde to come forward, or there are the avant-gardes and they are not pushing much enough to go on the front lines?
Well, obviously, accelerated culture was looking at a particular generation. So,
okay.
Of people that are probably now in their 50s. So, but so many of those people, including, just speaking about Martino Gamper or Tord or Constantine, they've taught the next generation. And so much like the baton was handed down from the Ron Arads and Jürgen Bays and Helle Jongeriuses to have this generation that we represented in an accelerated culture led on. I don't think they're holding anything back. I think they'd be very grateful. And certainly I think that going back to this generosity of spirit that I identify in that generation is that they encourage the next generation to move forward. I think what's happened is there's just been a proliferation. And so we're struggling to keep up with the number of designers that are coming out and looking for using design as an expressive tool or more autonomous process.
Great,
thank you.
Okay, next question from Brittany Luberda.
Oh, hi. I was curious if there was a sort of complementary RCA space right now, something that you feel in the US, since I'm selfish and curious about this side right now. If there was somewhere in the US that you feel has the kind of pulse that you felt in that Ron Aaron, kind of 90s, early 2000s.
Well, this is where I'm going to let myself down somewhat, because my knowledge of actually what's coming out of the world is not so good. I've been so focused this last few months that I haven't really looked beyond my rainbow. But Glenn, help me here.
Well, you know, in the States, I definitely think RISD is one of the main sites. And of course, we had Misha Khan as our very first guest out of there. Cranbrook, Chris Schenk was our second guest. I would also say well, to some extent for furniture, but more generally in design, certainly the California College of the Arts, former CCAC at West, very important. School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So there's quite a few bright spots right now.
And of course, now you're saying all of these, I'm kicking myself for not thinking of them, knowing most of the heads of those departments, including, you know, Helen and Maria.
Well, what about in Britain though? Where do you see the interesting design education happening, or do you feel like it's all just so stressed at the moment because of Brexit and everything else?
Yeah, Brexit has played a significant financial role in it, because unfortunately, also all tertiary education in the UK is paid for. So, and the international students pay even more than the local, you know, national students, and it's very difficult to be able to afford it. And I think, you know, we're being priced out of the market in a way here in the UK. And Brexit's taken quite a lot of the international students away. You can't get, if they can get a visa, they're only entitled to that student visa, and are pretty much going to be kicked out. Well, we don't know; it's all still being written, but we imagine it's going to be they'll be asked to leave the minute their education is finished. So it's a big question mark. Nobody knows, and everybody's very worried about. But no, I worry for the education system here in the UK.
Are you still keeping a close eye on Eindhoven, Design Academy Eindhoven? Because we had Orta Miklos with us last Wednesday, who are right out of that program now. I'm curious of your assessment of what their current trajectory might be.
Yeah, it's become much more political, conceptual, and critical, I guess less practical. No bad thing. I think the one good thing, actually speaking to Simone Farrison from Forma Fantasma, who is one of the tutors there, establishing a new course in Eindhoven, he was saying it's a safe space for the exploration of ideas. So something I borrowed from him earlier. And I think this is what it's not an expensive school to attend if it's actually fee paying at all. So they are being much more avant-garde and experimental, and
yeah, those two things often go together, don't they? You know, lack of crushing costs and experimentalism, true in real estate as well. So, okay, we have a question from Katie Tregeden. Hi, Katie.
Hi. I am a design writer and design author, and we've talked a lot about generosity of spirit. So first, thank you very much to both of you. This has been a really wonderful session. I have a question about the spaces that these sort of conversations we've been talking about take place. So Dayan Sujuk is quoted as saying that museums are the new magazines, and the sort of things he was able to do at Blueprint, he feels he's now only able to do in museum spaces. Whereas Libby, you seem to have moved from a sort of curatorial role into writing books, so from spaces to words. And obviously there are sort of tons of new podcasts and events like this happening now. So I'm interested to know what you see are the future spaces for these sorts of conversations that we've been talking about today to happen in.
Well, I think, you know, conversations like today are almost out of necessity. You know, we're all looking for things to be doing, and how we can keep conversations going and keep businesses and industries and people engaged. So, but you know, from the mother of necessity comes some wonderful inventions. So I'm 100% behind it. Spaces, museums. I mean, gosh, it'll be interesting to see what happens, what the real long-term effects are out of COVID-19, and how exhibitions are changed by having to shift online right now. The one thing I don't think we'll ever be able to get across is physicality and scale. I think it's very difficult, even in augmented or virtual realities. And I think that's something that museums and galleries will always have the benefit of being able to do. It's just how much we are able to access them and what the world looks like when we all emerge. But it is getting noisy. You know, there is a lot going on right now, and it's very difficult to try and keep up. And you know, unfortunately, this time last week, I should have been in Milan. I'm sure as many people who have joined us today should have been. And you know, that was like a wonderful store cupboard of ideas that's just been shut down to so many people. And you know, that makes me worried as to what conversations, you know, what we are going to be talking about in the coming months, weeks, years, whatever. Because there is so much noise on the internet. It's not the same space. In a confined environment like the Milan Furniture Fair, even though it's got 300,000 people coming in to visit it, you do feel like you're a captured audience and there's a murmur and everybody's sort of talking about the same thing. I can't keep it up on that same level with all of the events that are taking place over the World Wide Web right now. So I love it, but we need a program.
Yes, a single flow chart, right? Yeah, it'll be interesting to see after this lockdown finally ends whether there's a rush back to the physical object and the in-person, you know, IRL experience, or whether there's a continued vitality of these online platforms that we've been exploring. Maybe both, maybe some kind of more extreme combination of the two than we even had before. Yeah. But let's take one last question from Anna Aristova, or is Aristova? Anna, are you here? No? Anna? No? Okay. And I think, well, we'll go to one more question then from Andrew Erdos, glass artist here in the United States. Andrew?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hey, Andrew.
Okay, so at the beginning of the interview, Libby, you talked about you love to tell stories. And, you know, we've all had a lot of time to think, what is the story you want to tell next, or you think should be told next?
Goodness, that's no small question.
Good last question, though.
Well, I think some of the things that Glenn was bringing up shows where my thinking is. You know, I certainly have been enormously impressed by this conversation of geopolitics and collaboration and community spirit and how design can help solve that. I don't have a format for how that will come out yet, but that's certainly where my mind is right now. I'm looking at the background behind you and seeing some some beautiful glasswork, which I've been given the opportunity through this Frieze collective design project to get more involved, I guess, and learn more about disciplines that have not been my field. So interested more in glass and ceramics. So, but yes, I think it is really about understanding the opportunities that have come out of this forced confinement that enable collaboration and connectivity that perhaps do some good. Does that sound too easy?
No, that's a great note to end it on, actually, and very much the spirit in which we've undertaken this whole design and dialogue series, you know, to try to keep conversation going, try to keep community going, and also potentially, who knows, generate collaborations. But certainly it's a great opportunity to have fantastic discussions with people like you, Libby. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been a huge pleasure. And thanks, everybody. It doesn't happen to be your birthday, does it?
Oh, but you can still sing to me.
We haven't prepared anything, sadly, but perhaps people could just thank Libby in a musical spirit in the chat box. And please tune in next time. Actually, the next two sessions of this week are really, really fantastic, interesting, and important, because we have Alexandra Cunningham Cameron from the Cooper Hewitt, who's going to be talking about the Willie Smith show that was on for a criminally short amount of time after the lockdown started. So Willie Smith Street Couture, which hopefully people will be able to see after this is all over. And then on Friday, we have James Wines, who was the principal of site architecture, sculpture in the environment. And as people may know, James worked closely with Willie Smith to create the environment for his couture shops. So we have a kind of 1-2 this week with Alexandra talking about the show at the Cooper Hewitt, and then on Friday, James Wines giving a talk about his career and design as a critical practice. So that's it for today. Thanks again, Libby. It's been such a great pleasure.
I'm just trying to see who's been writing and who's in. I can't keep up, but it's so lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Isn't it interesting that the chat box on Zoom is like a recreation of the ancient scroll as a format?